Well, to understand better, we're going to speak to Mark Yarnell now. He is a senior advocate with Refugee International. And Mark, you've actually spent time at this camp. You know it well. Tell us about your impressions.
Well, look, I mean, the life in the camp is difficult for many people there. They receive assistance in terms of food and healthcare and education. And so they're able to get the basics of life. It's not ideal, but I think that right now, what's so terrible is that the camp is now scheduled to close. And the only option that's being offered is return to Somalia. And as tough as life can be in the camp, Somalia is much worse in terms of the insecurity, the lack of services, let alone the fact that it's continuing to experience its own humanitarian crisis. So I think that the closure of Dadaab and the effort to send people home prematurely is putting them into a more difficult situation.
And the obvious question, why has something not been worked out up to this point for these people?
That's an excellent question. I think a lot of it relates to politics. I think that, again, it isn't viable for people to return to Somalia, and so the hope is, could there be an option for them to locally integrate into Kenya, at least some of them? Can there be more options for resettlement to other countries? But there's such I think, a negative attitude towards refugees right now globally, and I think that it's playing out in Kenya, where the only option for people is to go back to a war-torn country.
Have there been any efforts to assimilate them into the community?
Well, for people who live there, and some have been there for as long as 20 years, some have been born in the camp,
wow.
They sort of have an informal integration, but legally they're not allowed to work, and they have limits on freedom of movement, and so they live in sort of a status of legal limbo where they aren't able to fully integrate. And so we're pushing Kenya to allow them, if they can't go back to Somalia, sort of allow them at least to live in Kenya.
So delaying closing this by 6 months, what will that accomplish?
Nothing. I mean, certainly it's good that they didn't rush to shut the camp down by the end of November as they said they would, but the situation is not going to improve much in Somalia within 6 months. I was there in September, and it was shocking. Sort of people who had returned to Somalia, the lack of services they could access, and many were saying, we're just going to go back to Kenya, or we're going to try to get to Europe or go other places because it's not a sustainable place to live.
In many ways, Dadaab is a city within itself. Why can it not function that way?
Well, exactly, and again, it's sort of an informal city, but the Kenyan government, despite the fact the camp has been there for over 20 years, has resisted allowing permanent infrastructure, paved roads, electric grids. There's sort of this feeling that we don't want to accept that it's been this long term and maintain kind of a temporary existence, even though the reality is much different. So it's been policy.
Anything the UN could do about this?
Well, I think it's certainly with the UN, we're trying to make sure that they do everything they can to keep supporting refugees in Dadaab. But it's a larger question for the global community, not just the UN, in terms of broader responsibility sharing for refugees. You know, as much as we want to criticize Kenya for what they're doing, they have been a host to refugees for decades, and many countries aren't willing to host refugees. And so I think looking at it more globally is an important responsibility.
Alrighty. Well, Mark Yarnell, we certainly appreciate your insight and your dedication to this and your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Mark Yarnell.